So far, we have done one of the 4 combat style DPS guides, and today we will be tackling the second one. Today's combat style that we will be going over is the ranged combat style. And like in the previous guide, we're going to be going over the abilities, relevant special attacks, and EoFs, and then do a rotation at the end. Before we get into this guide, I have to say a quick thank you to Forge Interactive for joining this channel. If you want to become a member, there is a link in the description. And I forgot I had this option for membership, but I have an option in there called the Exotic Collection for probably too much per month, but I believe it's the same as a Twitch tier 3 sub. Mr. Grazi123, thank you very much for the support. The top tier now has its own text channel where they are shouted out when they join, so thank you very much for the support. It is greatly appreciated. Now with all of that out of the way, let's actually get into this guide. So here is the ranged ability book in all of its glory. There's not too many abilities in here, at least compared to before, and that's kind of the whole theme of the EoC 2.0 update, is they took out a lot of so-called filler abilities and made it to where there was a lesser number of them, so in theory a new player would have an easier time learning the combat style. And just like with melee, we have basic abilities, we have enhanced abilities, we have ultimates, and we have a little bit more in the utility section this time. Although for utility, all we have is escape, which escape technically is a ranged ability, but its only requirement is 5 agility. Something interesting about escape is if you have a bow equipped, you will escape 8 tiles backwards from the direction you're facing, whereas by default it is 7 tiles, but it is a movement ability. It's not going to do any damage. The other 2 abilities in the utility section, we're going over this real quick just to get them out of the way, are the 2 quiver slots. This is for the Pernix quiver, so if you have 2 ammo types in there, you can have them individually keybound. It's just an option for people who want to keybind in that way. I personally just bind the quiver, but there are extra buttons here in case you want to do that. And with those quickly explained, now we can actually talk about the basic abilities. And starting off with the basic abilities, we have ranged, which is the basic attack that ranged has. There is no global cooldown. You just press it, it fires out a single shot, and it will go on global cooldown, but once that's done, you are able to press it again. For those who are unaware, global cooldown is 3 game ticks. Each game tick is 0.6 seconds, so every 1.8 seconds you can press an ability, and ranged has no additional cooldown time after being pressed, so you can just press this ability every 1.8 seconds. I don't recommend that unless it's literally all you have at the start of the game, but I'm an endgame player. This is going to be explained from the perspective of an endgame player, breaking down these abilities for you, but I digress. Next basic ability is Piercing Shot. Piercing Shot fires out 2 hits at once. They do 45 to 55% range damage per hit, and it generates 9 adrenaline. This is a nice ability for lining up Bow of the Last Guardian stacks. It's not the greatest damage. Something that it does nicely though is it reduces the cooldown of Snipe by 2.4 seconds. We'll get into that ability specifically later on. It's not a bad basic, it's not the worst, it's not the best, and you will see it mostly in rotations for, like I said earlier, lining up Bow of the Last Guardian stacks. The next basic is called Binding Shot, and this is your stun for ranged. With Binding Shot, you get 2 charges before it goes on cooldown, and its cooldown is 15 seconds. Now, if you press these stuns somewhat apart, you won't have to wait the full cooldown in order to get the first one back. So say you press Binding Shot, you wait 5 seconds, you press Binding Shot again, you'll only have to wait 10 seconds before you can fire another Binding Shot, but it will not refresh both charges instantly. It has to then wait that 5 seconds additionally in order to rebuild that second charge, and so on and so forth. This ability also works with the flanking perk. I don't know of anyone bringing flanking bulgs into instances, but I'd imagine it works just fine. So if you're an ultimate baller and want to test that for me, or you have used it, let me know in the comments below if it actually does work, at least with perfect equilibrium stacks and whatnot. But most people are just going to be saving this for things that they need need to be stunned in order to make them attackable, or like getting rid of the scarabs at Sanctum of Rebirth. Things like this is what you're going to be using this ability for. Gale Shot is an ability with a couple of things going on with it, where the hit itself is not that much damage. It's the same damage as a basic attack, but it has a self buff that will apply to you and last for 6 seconds. And in this 6-second window, you will deal an additional 465 bonus damage with each hit. And the duration of this Searing Winds self buff can be extended with an ability known as Rapid Fire. We'll go over that ability later on, but this ability works well with that one. The last basic here, but certainly not the least, is Greater Ricochet. Now, how Gricko works is technically it's an AoE tagging ability, where if you have a bunch of secondary targets near the main target, it'll then fire each of the arrows outward, and whatever hits do not go out to secondary targets will then just hit the main one. Now, this perk used to only fire 3 hits and then gain additional numbers of hits based off of a perk known as Caroming, but you just get the default 7 hits now with Greater Ricochet, and then Caroming will just add damage to each of the secondary hits. But to give you a quick example on how this works, here we have 3 combat dummies. I will attack this middle one. It's going to fire 7 arrows at it, or 7 hit splats at it, I should say. And you will notice that one of them will just break off and go to this dummy, and one will break off and go to this dummy, leaving 5 hit splats on the main target. So if I go ahead and press that, as you can see, there were 5 hits there, and then there was 1 on each of the secondary targets. Now, the way it calculates its damage is a little bit more involved than that, but it is the easiest way to think about this ability and not overwhelm yourself. Now we will move into the enhanced ability section, and first off we have Snapshot. Snapshot is just like a Roid Rage version of Piercing Shot. It fires 2 hits out, and each of them do anywhere from 135 to 155% damage per hit. However, unlike Piercing Shot, this ability has no actual cooldown. It just falls in line with the standard global cooldown, kind of like how the basic works. It uses 25% adrenaline, and so long as you have the spare adrenaline for this, you can just press Snapshot into Snapshot into Snapshot into Snapshot. Now, I wouldn't recommend doing this, but it is technically doable as a spam ability. Like Piercing Shot, this ability is very nice for lining up bulk stacks, and getting a 3rd hit out of Snapshot from a perfect equilibrium proc is very useful in DS rotations, as it is a strong ability. The next enhanced ability we have is Snipe, and Snipe does quite a lot of damage compared to what it once did. This ability now doesn't consume or gain any adrenaline at all, and it fires a single hit of 300 to 360% ability damage. It is actually very strong, and they made it to where it is now a 3-tick ability, not a 4-tick ability. Before, you would have to charge this ability up for an additional tick after global cooldown, and it broke up the flow of combat and was pretty annoying to use. I almost never used it before EoC 2.0, but now I'm using it quite regularly as like a finisher for phases or lining up with bulk stacks in order to maximize that special attack. I've mentioned bulk a few times. I will explain that in depth later on, but this ability is very nice, and if you remember back to the Piercing Shot description, this ability's cooldown is quite long. It is 1 minute, but it gets reduced by 2.4 seconds every time you press a Piercing Shot, and I believe if you're wearing Fleeting Boots, it will reduce itself by a further 1.8 seconds every time you press a basic ability. Now, unless this is written into a rotation for something endgame, you won't really be taking advantage of this kind of back and forth, this synergy, so to speak, but it is a nice thing to know for when you have to do some sort of improv thing at a boss. The next enhanced ability is Bombardment. Now, this AoE used to be so bad that nobody ever pressed it anywhere ever at all for any reason, and it's still pretty bad. It is not the greatest by any means because of things like Deci EoF. Again, we'll get into that later, but at least now with its damage range that it does for the adrenaline cost, and they buffed it to where it is now 2 tiles within the main target and not 1. It actually is a pretty solid AoE just to spam and kill off a couple things real quick. Like if you have a bunch of very low HP mobs that just need to be wiped out, this is something you could definitely use. It costs 25%, which is a little bit stiff, but overall it's not a bad ability to have in AoE situations when you need it. Next on the enhanced ability list is Rapid Fire. Now Rapid Fire works with the Dracolich set in order to get some massive buffs, and essentially Rapid Fire fires an arrow on every game tick for 8 game ticks. Each hit is only 75 to 85% damage, and it says here each attack extends the duration of Searing Winds by 0.6 seconds. So if you remember Gale Shot's buff, essentially this pauses Gale Shot's buff from going down. And with Searing Winds active, this does quite a lot of damage with full or when arrows, whichever you happen to be using, or if you're killing dragons you can use some Dragon Banes, but I digress. And the way this works with Dracolich Infusion is if you fully channel out this ability, meaning you get all 8 hits, you then get a window of time, I believe it's 4 GCDs long if you are wearing the entire Dracolich effect, where your crit chance is buffed by like 40%, so you effectively have 100% crit chance, or close enough really. And so what you'll see people do is they'll rapid fire and then dump a bunch of strong abilities and then kind of build adrenaline back up and use some other abilities to keep damage going in between the 2 rapid fires that they'll be doing. But saving your big hit abilities for after rapid fire is definitely something to get good practice in with. Next up on the list we have Shadow Tendrils. Shadow Tendrils fires out 1 ginormous hit at 200 to 240%. Not quite as big as Snipe, but it's only a 45-second cooldown instead of a 1-minute cooldown, so kind of makes sense. And this ability has a mechanic to where you're doing a lot of damage at once to a target, but it will hit you in return. But it is something to keep in mind to where if you're really trying to like juice the Zerk Fury relic, I have definitely taken myself to death's office a couple times by pressing this ability. And what's nice is this ability will extend the duration of Shadow Imbued by 3.6 seconds. And speaking of Shadow Imbued, we'll go ahead and move on to the next ability, which is called Imbue Shadows. Now, this is a self buff, meaning it doesn't fire anything at the target. It doesn't do any sort of hit or anything like that. It is a self buff, and you can cast this outside of combat. And what happens is once you press this, every single range hit that you do will generate 5% adrenaline. So if you do a rapid fire with Imbue Shadows going, you will get 40% adrenaline back from this ability alone. You will also get additional adrenaline from Dracolich, but I just wanted to illustrate the point here on Imbue Shadows. And with Shadow Tendrils, you can get 33.6 seconds of duration with this ability. So if you start out your big rotation, you will be getting a lot of adrenaline back from things like your Grit Goes, your piercing shots do decent, rapid fire is a big adrenaline return, and it will really help you pump out the damage on your upcoming rotations. And the last enhanced ability we're going to be taking a look at is Corruption Shot. Now, Corruption Shot is an AoE ability, but it now costs 20% adrenaline and has a 15-second cooldown. And the main change that happened to this ability is the main target no longer has to be in contact with the other enemies for the corruption to spread. It'll actually search for other targets within a 5-tile range of the main target, kind of like Gricko does, but it's only for up to 5 additional enemies, whereas Gricko is looking for up to 6. And then it will just apply the standard damage over time to all of the targets that it touches. It used to be a very nice basic damage wise, and it synergized with a lot of other parts of range, but now it's strictly an AoE and it's not that strong of one in practice. There are definitely better strategies for ranged AoE damage at this point. I still keep mine on my bar, but I don't use it too often anymore. All right, now we are looking at the final 2 abilities here, and that is the 2 ultimate abilities that ranged has. The first ultimate here is Deadshot. Now, regardless if you have the Zuck Cape or not, this ability will always cost 60% adrenaline base, and with the cape it fires out 8 hits of anywhere from 55 to 75% range damage, and this is something that is going to synergize very well with Gale Shot being active and just after a rapid fire buff to guarantee those crits, and being on a 30-second cooldown, you're going to want to just save it for that point in time anyways. And when you kind of line this up with all of the other buffs that range has, that's when this ability very much comes alive. If you don't have any buffs active, it's still strong, but it's not that strong. It definitely is one of those abilities you need other buffs active in order for it to really let its damage shine. And if you don't have the Zuck Cape on, it's only 4 hits, but it acts pretty much the same exact way. But I'd imagine most people looking at a ranged DPS guide are at least going to have the normal mode cape for ranged, but once again, I digress. The other ultimate ability is Greater Death Swiftness. Now, Greater Death Swiftness just adds duration to where you don't need a planted feet swap anymore. That's all that greater version does, but DS is the bread and butter of ranged DPM. If you're range camping, you will pretty much be pressing this every minute on the minute and then optimizing your rotation for the duration this ability is active. Now, this ability used to be something that you would plant and you would have a 7x7 square that you could run around in and gain a buff, much like Sunshine works. But what they changed about this is it's now a self-buffing ability, meaning you can run around to your heart's content and just go between like different locations of a boss arena, go like from the main area of a masket and then go inside and kill stuff. You still have your DS active. I believe you can even carry it over from Telos P4 to P5. Raksha, I don't think you can carry it over because that wipes all buffs, but what I'm trying to get at is now you can be very mobile with this combat style and its ultimate, and it's very nice to see. And what this ultimate actually does is buffs all of the damage while it's active that you do by 50%. All of the range attacks just get a 1.5x multiplier slapped on them. So some of the abilities that were seeming pretty weak before, once you have DS active, they do a decent chunk of damage, to say the least. Alrighty, that was a lot of discussion on, that was a lot of explaining on the abilities and what they are and how they work and whatnot, but now we are going to get into the special attacks, EoFs, and any other relevant set effects before we get into rotations. Alrighty, we are now going to talk about the special attacks and EoFs and any other set effects and buffs and whatnot that I can think of that are relevant to ranged DPS. And when talking about special attacks, we need to talk about the bread and butter weapon of ranged, and that is the Bow of the Last Guardian. This is the best in slot bow, and it has its own passive and special attack that work well with each other, but you have to have this bow equipped in order to take advantage of its effect. You can't have it in an EoF, you can't have it and then swap over to crossbows. It doesn't work like that. It only works with the bow being equipped. And how this bow works is every single hit that range does, other than bleed damage hits, will gain you a perfect equilibrium stack. When you're doing rotations with range, you'll see a number up in your buff bar that'll constantly be counting, and when this number hits 8, it will then consume all of the stacks, reset to 0, and then give you an additional hit. It's usually a percentage of whatever that hit was that caused the proc to happen. Now, way back in the day, it used to just copy and paste a third hit and just throw that out there, but that was way too strong when we did a combat update in March of 2024. So now it just takes a percentage of whatever the damage number was that caused the proc to happen. And so if you've ever heard a ranger talk about counting stacks or counting up the number of hits, they're keeping track of it. This is what they've been referring to, is keeping an eye on the number of bulk stacks they're at, what the next ability is they want to do, and how many stacks that's going to give, whether it's going to proc or whether they need to change the rotation slightly. And the improv nature of this was a little bit more relevant back in the old EoC system, where our adrenaline gain was based off of crit crit chance, but now that it is a perfect science, it's guaranteed you get the same amount of adrenaline per hit. The rotations have been pretty much scienced out at this point for any given boss, and then you can just follow it and it will work out the same every single time. Now, what the special attack does for Bow of the Last Guardian is it halves this perfect equilibrium requirement of 8 stacks to proc and halves it, bringing it down to 4. And so if you're on 0 stacks, you press Greco, it will run all the way up to 4, consume a proc, and then give you the additional hit, and then it will bring you back to 3 because that's how many hits were left during the cycle. And the special attack itself fires a single hit of 235 to 255% range damage. It is very strong, and if you press this special attack on 3 stacks or higher, it will get doubled by its own effect, so that's always kind of fun. Now, there is a bug out there with Bow of the Last Guardian that involves stalling and releasing with certain abilities, and you'll see some very high level top end rotations that have like anywhere from 4 to 8 stalls in a single DS rotation. I don't do that. I don't partake in any of that. I don't care enough about that extra damage in order to do something that obnoxious, but I did want to make note of it for anyone out there who wants to go above and beyond and learn more about it. I believe there might be a write-up in PvME, or some other high-level player has done a write-up somewhere. If you ask around, you'll end up finding someone who knows, but for 99% of ranged users out there, it's not gonna happen. Now, the rest of the special attacks that range has to offer is all going to be sitting in EoFs. And I have 3 main EoFs that I pretty much bring unless a boss is of a certain size. There's one EoF for doing AoE damage if I really need to crank out some AoE. And then there are 2 honorable mention EoFs that either have niche use cases in certain rotations or have been kind of phased out, but I will still make note of them. And then after that, I'll go over like the main arrow types that people use and how they work. But jumping into the first EoF here, we have the Seren Godbow. Now, SGB requires a target to be a 5x5 in order to guarantee all of its hits to hit a target. Technically, if a target's a 3x3, you can still get away with pressing SGB, and it's more likely than not to be worthwhile the button press. But most people will save this spec for targets that are 5x5 or bigger. And this is just a single GCD attack. It's just you press it once, it does its thing, you move on to the next ability. It launches 5 arrows into the air, and then they all rain down on the target. The first arrow is always guaranteed to hit the target. Arrows 2 through 5 are the ones that can have some RNG on smaller targets. The special attack costs 30% base adrenaline, and it does anywhere from 125 to 155% range damage per arrow. If you see someone using this spec, it usually does anywhere, I believe, from like 50 to 80k damage if all the arrows are hit and you're under all of the good effects that range has. You'll mostly see the special attack getting used at some place like Glacor, or if you see someone running ED2 still. Zamorak, this EoF is extremely useful. If you're unsure about a target's size, it's available either on the wiki, or if you're in PvME, just click on the boss on like the basic info, and it usually says in the little image they made, whether it's like a 1x1, a 2x2, a 3x3, a 5x5, whatever the boss size is, it'll usually have it in there as well. But overall, this is a very strong EoF wherever it works. So if it is a giant boss, bring the giant damage spec. The next bread and butter ranged EoF that I bring pretty much everywhere is the ECB EoF. And as you can see here, it says Split Soul, and you might be thinking to yourself, wait, Necromancy has Split Soul. Did Ranged copy it? And the answer to that is no. Ranged was the original one to have the Split Soul effect. ECB was released in 2019, and originally it was applying blight damage, but now it's Split Soul damage. I could go into the history of it, but I won't do that here. And effectively, effectively what Split Soul does is it takes 400% of the number that was normally going to heal you and then apply that as damage to the target. If you've ever watched someone range and then you see their soul split overhead prayer turn to like a dark purple with a kind of some black outlines or details inside of it, that is this special attack in effect. It lasts for 15 seconds, it costs 25% base adrenaline, and essentially anywhere I can get away with barely living to do more damage, I am using this EoF all the time. The third bread and butter EoF for ranged now is the Gloomfire Bow EoF. And this one's kind of a new one for me. I was very much a holdout on the Dark Bow EoF, saying that, you know, it was close enough just as good, and that was just because I was lazy and didn't want to rewire my brain to work with a 3-hit EoF that really needed you to line up everything on the 3rd hit. But ever since I learned the new ranged melee Vork method that used it, and also learned the 2k group ranged melee Brid method for Zamorak, I've pretty much made the switch over to Gloomfire Bow, and it is better, it is stronger. And how this special attack works is the first 2 hits are kind of weak at 85 to 105% range damage, but the 3rd hit is an absolute dump truck of a hit at 255 to 295%. Now, if you go ahead and screw up this EoF and you don't line it up properly with your Bolg procs, it does like a very, very minimal amount of damage less than a dark bow. So if you screw up with this, it's definitely not the end of the world. And on average, if you line it up properly, it is going to be significantly stronger. And I would definitely recommend, if you're new getting into best in slot range rotations and kind of end game range stuff, definitely learn to use the Gloomfire Bow. Don't go back on like the older methods of dark bow and stuff and then force yourself to relearn later. It's just gonna give you a much bigger headache. Ask me how I know, because I had to go through it. And the situational EoF that I sometimes bring is the Decimation EoF. Its special attack, Locate, essentially turns your bow into an AoE machine. It'll take any ability that you do and throw it onto 5 additional enemies within 3 tiles of the target. I use this anywhere that I need to do any form of AoE damage. However, most boss instances or boss encounters don't have a whole lot of AoE elements to them, but when you do need to bring out some AoE, definitely bring out this EoF. It is absolutely worth doing. Now, the 2 honorable mention EoFs that I wanted to throw in here, I believe some rotations do call for Darkbow EoF, but they are very few and far between. What I would say is nice about Darkbow is if for some ungodly reason someone wanted to just be an absolute range pure and start a fresh account only ever using one combat style, then I could see Darkbow being a decent first EoF if you're on a more budget conscious setup as part of the upgrade process, and then you save it for later on when you need it in those niche scenarios. But I haven't pulled my Darkbow EoF out at all from what I can remember, at least in the past couple months. So if you have one of these and you need another EoF for like a different style, you could probably get away with replacing this one, but there also might be some instances where it's used. So you could kind of throw this EoF into the situation of, okay, if I need it for this specific situation, just swap out like a G-Staff EoF, put it in like one of the cheaper EoFs, and that becomes like a situational one. But if you never use a Darkbow EoF again, you probably be fine. Now, another honorable mention EoF that I actually have seen a few rotations using is the Zamorak bow. Now, the Zamorak bow is just a weaker version of Darkbow, but it uses less adrenaline. Think of this as a nice midway point between Snapshot and Darkbow. All 3 of these things function the same way, but the Zammy bow is middle adrenaline, middle damage. And I believe on the PVME the Nakatra rotation, or maybe it was the Kezalam. I saw a couple of Zebos getting used in that rotation specifically. Again, if you still have one, you might as well keep it around, but it's also a relatively cheap EOF, so if you need to replace this and the Darkbow one for other combat styles, and you're not doing any boss that has it written into its rotation where you need this EOF, you probably don't need to bring this anywhere, but I did want to just bring these up as they still might be useful. All right, the last thing I'm going to explain very quickly before we get into the actual rotations is the different mainstay arrows of range that you're going to be using. Now, the three main arrow types that I use pretty much anywhere are the Deathspore arrows, the Full arrows, and the Wen arrows. Deathspore arrows allow you to essentially use a threshold or an ultimate for absolute free, and the way I use these arrows is just to get a free death swiftness and then move into a rotation afterwards. So I'll do something like a piercing shot, a greater ricochet, another piercing shot, press my DS, go onto my damage arrows, and move on from there. And the effect has a 30-second cooldown. Full arrows are very simple arrows. They give you plus 15% damage on top of their normal damage figure, and they do have a 10% penalty on hit chance. But with 120 combat and a few other accuracy changes and whatnot, you're not really going to run into issues with full arrows causing you to go below 100% accuracy at this point. And the Wen arrows basically function on an idea of build up 10 stacks and then you get a 9-second window where you get 30% damage increase. And you can't consume stacks before you build up 10. You have to build them up all the way to 10. Then you get your 9-second window, rinse and repeat. Now, I don't use Wen arrows nearly as much as I probably would otherwise because I do a lot of hybrid with range at this point, and building up 22 stacks of arrows and effects and whatnot is pretty annoying and usually not worthwhile in most hybrid situations. In a couple, like in Zamorak, you can get away with it, but I believe this is more for a ranged camp setup, or again, if you have a specific rotation written out for you, then use them there. Now, an honorable mention for arrows that I do use somewhat often, but not as often, is the Jas Dragonbane arrows. These are just a flat 30% damage and 20% hit chance increase on anything that is considered a dragon. And it says here, if you cast Toon Baneite Ore, you can turn them into Demon Bane arrows, and they function exactly the same, except they work on demons instead of dragons. These are very strong arrows. They are just as strong as Wen arrows, but only on very specific creatures. So I put it in the honorable mention category. Now, I'm sure I will get questions or comments about some other arrows that I may have missed, something like Bic arrows or maybe even splintering arrows. Both of these arrows I don't use anymore in any capacity. I tested splintering arrows out on a couple places at the very beginning of the update and haven't really found any use for them. They're pretty terrible. And Bic arrows, they seem like they could be strong. I think most people sit on the copium of at Glaycore, they're still okay, or some other places. I see a lot of casual rangers using this, and maybe in a non-best in slot environment, I could see these maybe having some use to help increase damage. But in any standard best in slot situation, I don't use these at all. They're too annoying at 30 seconds, requiring upkeep for any sort of hybrid rotation, and I don't think the damage is worthwhile over the other arrow options. Blackstone arrows technically still have some uses, but with 120 combats giving you a lot of accuracy at this point, I haven't really had a need to use Blackstone arrows to get some extra accuracy. But if you find yourself in a situation where you need them, you can bring them along. Editor's note: put this in between the arrows and the EoFs. Now, the Dracolich set effect I did touch on a little bit earlier, but I'm just going to go ahead and explain it fully here. It is a tier 92 armor set. Yes, this is not legendary armor. This is technically the same tier as Elite Sirenic. This is just bow armor, whereas Elite Sirenic is crossbow armor. No, I won't go on the TED talk I have about the entire design philosophy of ranged here. This is a DPS DPS guide. If you want to know my thoughts, just try and find me the next time I'm streaming and ask me about it. But anyways, how this armor set works is per piece worn, channeling rapid fire generates 0.5% adrenaline every 0.6 seconds. That is the first piece. So if you only have one, you get a little bit of extra adrenaline on rapid. If you have the full 5 piece, that's 2.5% adrenaline per rapid fire hit. And if you fully channel the rapid fire, like I said before, you effectively get a window of opportunity where your crit chance is increased by 40% after the rapid fire is done. And you get this with as low as a 3-piece set effect, although it only lasts for 3 seconds, so effectively 2 global cooldowns. And then for piece 4 and piece 5, you gain an additional 1.8. So if you wear the full 5 piece, you get 4 GCDs worth of crit chance increase after you do your full rapid fire. Alrighty, we have gone over quite a bit of information, but it is time for some example rotations. And the relics that I am using here for ranged are the same for pretty much every combat style. I use COE with Zerker's Fury and Font of Life. There might be some boss specific rotations or methods that call for a different relic setup, but in general this is the one I will be using. And I will be doing 2 rotations here, and I'll be doing 2 Death Swiftness rotations. For those who are maybe a little bit confused on what a rotation is, really quick, it is just the order of abilities that you're doing in a given period of time. And with range, just like any other combat style, we will be focusing our rotations around Death Swiftness and its 1-minute timer. And being that there is no actual guideline for how long or short a rotation can be, I'll just be focusing here on Death Swiftness rotations. And I'll be doing one with SGB and one without SGB. Now, the SGB damage isn't going to show up as well because these dummies are only a 1x1, as I explained earlier. You need a 5x5 target in order for it to, actually do all of its damage. It'd be really funny if, like, somewhere over in the corner here we had a 5x5 combat dummy for testing and whatnot, but we don't really have anything like that, so I'll just do it anyways on this middle dummy as more of just an example. And to start out, what I'm going to do is just use my Death Spore arrows to build up enough stacks, get a free Death Swiftness, and go into the rotation from there. And I'll be going to my full arrows after I'm done with my Death Spores. But what I will show you guys is how I get a bunch of Death Spore stacks really quickly. If say I'm here getting ready to go do a boss or whatever and I'm about to run into the portal, I have all my stuff, I have my prayers up and everything's ready to go. What I will do is attack this dummy and stall a Gricko, and then just run into the boss per usual. And by the time you make it over to the boss that you want to attack, you can then just target cycle, release the Gricko into another Gricko, and you will just immediately have your Death Spore stacks on the first global cooldown of the boss fight. And in EoC 2.0, all you have to do to stall an ability is be outside of attack range and then press it. Your character will want to run in, but you just click away. The ability is now stalled. And then if you want to release it, you can either just click on another target or hit the target cycle key, whatever you have that key bound to, and then it just automatically releases. But that is enough yapping. Let's go ahead and do an example with SGB. Now, I'm not going to be able to rely fully on the adrenaline refund from SGB, so if you're using this out of place, where it will fully hit guaranteed, you should be able to do this without an A-pot, but I'm going to go ahead and use an A-pot in order to sort of guarantee the rotation to work. Or if you end up finding some inconsistency at a boss, you can go ahead and use an A-pot here, although it shouldn't be necessary. We have our Gricko stalled up, ready to go, so we'll go ahead and release into another Gricko, and then go ahead and hit our Death Swiftness, Imbue Shadow, an ECB EoF, a Bow of the Last Guardian spec. Go ahead and hit Gale Shot, and then a Rapid Fire. Go ahead and hit our A-pot just to make sure. Go ahead and Gloomfire spec into a Dead Shot, and SGB into another Gloomfire. And then here I'm going to hit Gricko into a Tendrils. Maybe a couple of snapshots here. Another ECB, and then I'll go for another Gale Shot, another Rapid. Then here I'll go for a Gloomfire EoF, a Gricko into a Snipe, and that will conclude our DS rotation. Alrighty, now we're going to do the example rotation without an SGB. This would be pretty useful on anything that isn't a ginormous target. And typically what I've been doing in these situations is just moving my shadow tendrils in place of my SGB and just improving around that. What I think I'm actually going to do is a little bit of on-the-fly improv here and put a Bow of the Last Guardian spec in place of where I normally put my SGB, so that way I still get the perfect equilibrium proc for my shadow tendrils and for my snipe. That may throw some things off if you're doing some wild hybrid stuff, but if you're just a style camp, you're gonna be using your APOT anyways, so might as well be throwing it in the DS to make it a little bit more worthwhile. But anyways, we'll go ahead and install our Gricko here, and then we'll just go ahead and surge on up in order to sort of just wait for the cooldown. And then once we're ready, we'll go ahead and target cycle to release and then hit another Gricko into a Death Swiftness, Imbue Shadow, hit our ECB EoF, and then Bulk Spec. Then do a Gale Shot into a Rapid Fire and hit our APOT. And here I'll go ahead and do a Gloomfire Spec, a Dead Shot into a Bulg into another Gloomfire, and then we'll hit our Gricko into a Tendrils, into a Snap, another Snap, and then we'll go ahead and hit our ECB, and then do another Gale Shot into a Rapid Fire. Then here I'll hit another Gloomfire spec, and then Gricko into Snipe. And that'll be a DS rotation. Now, if it was just me playing around and I was just kind of being done with the fact of DS, if I was actually style camping, I would probably maybe hit another Dead Shot if I can, but notice we don't really have time to do much here because we're already needing to build back up for another DS. And in fact, I think that's going to make a good point here of with range camp specifically, once you're done with DS, you don't really have a whole lot of time in order to do an in-between Death Swift rotation before you need to start building up your Death Spore stacks and starting another Death Swiftness rotation. And so if you end up bringing Wen arrows, you'll pretty much do a DS and then build up your Wen arrows and Death Spore stacks, and then go right into another DS. It pretty much lines up nicely, at least when I've tried range camp in a few places. The fans of the channel, both new and old, probably know I have not really style camped anything in a long time. I like to do hybrid stuff, so Wen arrows haven't been used a whole lot by me, but when I have used them, most notably in something like Sanctum of Rebirth is where I can remember using them the most. I was finding this to be the case even on the beginning of EoC 2.0. Now, for those who have made it this far in this video, I'm sure you will want this knowledge here, so I'll go ahead and show you how I build up stacks and go into a DS. We'll just kind of assume that I've gotten off of a DS, I'm kind of building back up Adrenaline, and I want to build up my Wen stacks and my Death Spore stacks as soon as possible and get right into a DS rotation. So what I would do is I would go ahead and have my Wen arrows equipped, and I would go ahead and hit a Gricko, a Piercing Shot, and a Basic, and there is my 10 for my Wen arrows. Put on my Death Spores, hit a Pierce, hit 2 Basics in a row, and then another Gricko, and then as you can see, I now have my Death Spore stacks. I have my Wen arrows ready to go whenever I need it to. And in a DS rotation, I will typically put my Wen arrows back on for the Gale Shot just to make sure that the cooldown gets refreshed, because as you can see, they went away. They only last 30 seconds when you have the 10 stacks built up, and some bosses have a little bit longer spawn in animations, or if you're in an immune spot or something like that, it can get a little bit tricky. So I do like to do that trick where I put on the Wen arrows for the Gale Shot and then immediately go back to full arrows for most of the Rapid Fire, and then on usually on either 2.4 seconds left of the Rapid Fire, or you can even throw it on at the very tail end of your rapid. That is when you equip the Wen arrows. I believe at 2.4 it's the tick perfect way, but some people will throw it on even later, and it just guarantees that you have your Wen arrow buff active when you are doing all of the damage dumping you would normally do after a rapid fire, because you have your Dracolich buff, you're getting 30% from Wen arrows. You're kind of just stacking all of the buffs at once right onto all of those good abilities. I know I said I wouldn't do a Wen arrow rotation, but I already showed you how I build up the stacks. I might as well show you guys guys the little bit extra here, and I'm going to do a little bit more on the fly improv with this one, and I'm going to switch my bulk spec and my ECB in that beginning part of the DS in order to try and let ECB have a little bit more duration on the big hitting abilities. Also, sometimes I won't really build up when arrows for the second rapid fire because it seems like I don't use that many actual thresholds or special attacks in my second rapid other than the one gloom fire. It's definitely worthwhile, but it's just something personally I don't do a whole lot of. I pretty much just set up the one arrows for the first rapid. I still find them somewhat obnoxious to use, but it is what it is. But that example rotation would look something like this. We'll go ahead and hit a Greco into a piercing shot and go into a basic. Put on our death spores, go ahead and hit a piercing shot, 2 basics, and then a Greco after that. Go ahead and hit DS, imbue shadows, bulk spec, then ECB. Put on our 1 arrows for the gale shot just to refresh the timer, and then rapid fire with our full arrows. Put on our Wens halfway through, hit a gloom fire into a dead shot, into a SGB, a gloom fire, and here I'll go ahead and hit Greco into tendies, pierce, a snap, and then go ahead and hit an ECB, gloom fire, or a gale shot into a rapid. Bulk spec ran out there, so what I'll go ahead and do is just hit a Greco into a snipe and just call that good for that rotation, and then I would just keep building up from there. We have only 10 seconds till DS, so I would just build up adrenaline, get my death spores, build up the stacks needed, and go on to another death swiftness rotation. And it seems like the surfers are getting kind of spotty here, so I think that will be it for the example rotations. It took me far too many attempts just from server stability alone of just randomly lagging. There was also some skill issue involved, but hopefully you were able to pull out some information from this and learn a couple things about the ranged combat style. If you have questions, leave them in the comments below. I also am streaming on Twitch somewhat often now. If you have any further questions, you could also ask me there when I'm live. My Twitch and other things are always linked in the description below, but that's all I really have to say about this.